Hello Gators, my name is Luke. I'm in 5th grade and I've been going to Violet Gibson Elementary since I was in kindergarten. That's 6 years. I'd like to share a story with you called The Two Mrs. Gibsons. I've heard this story a lot over my years at Violet Gibson because it's about the woman our school is named after, Violet Gibson. I've learned a lot from Mrs. Gibson even though I've never met her. Let's find out more about this remarkable woman in this book, The Two Mrs. Gibsons. Two Mrs. Gibsons. Story by Toyomi Igas and pictures by Darryl Wells. I once knew two Mrs. Gibsons. This Mrs. Gibson was tall. Her skin was the color of chocolate. She was born in America in a place called Tennessee. This Mrs. Gibson was small. Her skin was the color of vanilla. She was born in Japan in a place called Gifu. This Mrs. Gibson gave hugs that were like being wrapped up in a great big fat bearskin rug. "Come here and give me some sugar," she would say. This Mrs. Gibson gave hugs that were like being wrapped up in a light down-filled comforter. At bedtime, she'd stroke my hair and hum Sakura until I fell asleep. This Mrs. Gibson was loud. She had a big laugh and a big voice, which would get louder when she was angry or when she was singing. And she seemed to be singing all the time. "This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine." This Mrs. Gibson was quiet. She would cover her mouth when she laughed, so you could never see her teeth. And when she was angry, she'd get even quieter. This Mrs. Gibson had small hands that could make the littlest, prettiest strokes with a pen, when she would write our names in Japanese. Kamiki, Akimi, Toyomi, Yoshiteru. This Mrs. Gibson had big hands. They looked like they covered all the keys on the piano when she played her favorite spirituals. "This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine." Sometimes this Mrs. Gibson would look kind of sad, and then she would let me dress up in one of the kimonos she had packed away in an old trunk. "These are very special," she would say as she tied the obi around my waist. "Don't get them dirty." The other Mrs. Gibson's clothes were much too big for me to dress up in, but I liked to wear her fancy hats. "This is my Sunday go-to-meeting hat," she would say as she'd take the long pointy hat pin out of my hair. "Don't get it dirty now." In the evening in the garden, this Mrs. Gibson would help me make magical lamps by catching fireflies and putting them in a jelly jar. They would glow, and then we'd let them go. Later at dinner time, this Mrs. Gibson would make more magic. Her hands would turn little bits of napkins into a whole flock of long-neck cranes. We would throw them into the air, and they would fly and flutter down to the ground. "Happy birds," she would always say. This Mrs. Gibson always had a pot of rice cooking.
We would eat it with bits of meat and vegetables on it, with plenty of shoyu. Anytime we were hungry, she would take her long chopsticks and stir up dinner in the blink of an eye. This Mrs. Gibson always had a pot of greens cooking. Turnip greens, dandelion greens, mustard greens, all from the garden. Everything she cooked seemed to take a long, long time. This Mrs. Gibson had short, curly hair that she would oil and braid up every night while she listened to the radio. She liked to braid my hair too, but she would always give me one big fat braid that would hang down over my forehead. I didn't like that braid, so I would go to the other Mrs. Gibson, and she'd take it out. This Mrs. Gibson used to have long, stick-straight hair, but she cut it short and tried to make it curly. She said she wanted to be more American. This Mrs. Gibson's other name was Kazumi. Everyone called her Kaz or Connie because they couldn't pronounce Kazumi. I called her Mommy because she was my mother. This Mrs. Gibson's other name was Viola. Everyone called her Vi or Reverend Gibson because she was a church minister. I called her Nanny because she was my grandmother. I once knew two Mrs. Gibsons. They were very different, but they had a lot in common. They both loved my daddy, and they both loved me.
As you heard, Mrs. Gibson was a wonderful woman with a lot of personality. Now that you have heard the story, let me share with you some of her many accomplishments. Here I am standing in the center of our school, and just like me, Viola Gibson attended the Cedar Rapids Community School District. She was trained as a practical nurse and worked as a Red Cross home nursing instructor. When African Americans, including her nephew, were denied to Ellis Pool, Mrs. Gibson was inspired to found the Cedar Rapids chapter of the NAACP in 1942. Mrs. Gibson was instrumental in introducing Black history into the Cedar Rapids schools. In the 1960s, Viola led a campaign to convince the Iowa congressional delegation to support the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Mrs. Gibson provided leadership for countless community and religious organizations and projects. Some examples include the Lynn County Daycare Center, Bender Pool, Jane Boyd Community House, Oakland Hill Senior Housing, and the Whitwer Senior Center. Her list of honors includes Churchwoman of the Year in 1969 by Cedar Rapids Area Council of Churches, Outstanding Citizen of Iowa by the USJCs, and Outstanding Older Iowa in 1979 by the Governor's Conference on Aging. The NAACP holds the annual Yes Can Awards in her honor. Mrs. Gibson was inducted into the Iowa Women's Hall of Fame in 2016. A former student at Viola Gibson, Stephanie Winklowski, wrote this to nominate Mrs. Gibson into this prestigious group.
Viola Gibson changed the Cedar Rapids community by promoting human rights and fostering peace. One summer day in 1942, Viola's nephew was denied entry to the Ellis Pool due to his race. Gibson protested the fact that her nephew was unable to enter the pool. On June 17, 1942, Gibson started the local chapter of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. After Gibson's successful protest, the rules were changed to allow African Americans entrance to the pool.